Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Atlantic Council. My name is David Livingston, and I'm a Deputy Director here in our Global Energy Center with responsibility for our advanced energy and climate work. Considering that our Global Energy Center is less than 5 years old, in fact, only around 3 years old today, it is with great pride and with great excitement that we gather here today to host the official U.S. launch of the 2018 Global Renewable Status Report from REN21. Our sincere thanks to REN21 for choosing us as the venue for launching this incredibly important publication. It has truly become the go-to barometer for the status of the global energy transition and the growth of renewable energy around the world today. I would like to remind everyone that this event is on the record and open to the media. I would also encourage you to share your thoughts, reactions, and questions by tweeting to us at AC Global Energy. Again, that's at AC Global Energy. This event would not be possible without the generous support and cooperation of our co-hosts, the American Council on Renewable Energy, ACORE, nor without the tireless work of our incredible staff, most notably Becca Hunziker, who's somewhere here in the room. It has been a banner decade, in fact, for renewable energy. 2018 is poised to be the 9th straight year in which global renewables investment has exceeded $250 billion, $250 billion. According to BlackRock, renewable energy now represents approximately 30% of the global addressable market in infrastructure. In other words, renewables are big business. There are few that understand that better and the implications that it brings than John Morton. John has enjoyed a career that has spanned business, government, and nonprofit work, and in the Obama administration served as the Chief Operating Officer of the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, OPIC, and later as the Senior Director for Energy and Climate Change at the National Security Council. John is intimately familiar with the policy mechanisms that have given rise to the energy transition, the economic logic sustaining the energy transition's growth, and the actions needed to fully harvest its potential for the globe in the years to come. It's a pleasure to hand off the baton to him today and allow this to proceed as we discuss REN21's Global Renewable Status Report. Thanks, John.
Thank you, David and Atlantic Council, and welcome everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm going to keep my remarks brief because I think the real meat of the conversation is sitting here in front of us in the front row. Just to give a couple highlights, however, without taking away from the meat that will come in just a moment. I think you're about to hear data and facts in a fascinating new report, full of data and insights that I think should simultaneously give us confidence about the trajectory that we're on, but also give us significant pause for concern. And I think any conversation about renewable energies these days is a combination of those two factors. We're on a good trajectory, but we've got to do a lot more. So on the good side, we have this report confirms that the transition to a low carbon economy is in fact occurring at an extraordinarily fast clip. And frankly, a clip that is faster than most people realize. And there, I think that highlights an interesting set of considerations and concerns for us all. Because there is, in my belief, a dangerous gap currently between the perception of where we are in this transition to a low-carbon economy and the reality of how quickly that transition is occurring. And when policy is made on the back of bad or outdated data and perceptions, I think we all can agree that you get inefficient, expensive, and in the world of energy and climate change, you get dangerous outcomes. And so I think there's a very important work to be done in terms of narrowing the gap between the perception of where we are in this transition and the reality of how fast it's occurring. And that's some of the work that I'm working on with the Atlantic Council going forward. So we're on a fast trajectory, but it's not occurring fast enough. We are not on a 2-degree pathway, the Paris Agreement goals. And of course, there's many people, myself included, that agree that a 2-degree pathway is insufficient to save the world from the worst impacts of climate change as well. we need an incremental somewhere on the order of $27 trillion of investment into the global energy systems between now and 2030 in order to meet the Paris Agreement goals. That sounds like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money. And that money is not going to come from public coffers. It's not going to be taxpayer money that gets us to $27 trillion in incremental investment over the next 12 years. Where is it going to come from? It's going to come from private markets. And the question that many of us have to figure out is, how do we catalyze, how do we send market signals, and how do we encourage private investment into the renewable energy market? And I think that some of the statistics you'll hear today will give you confidence that that transition is occurring and it's expediting, but we need to expedite it further. That $27 trillion of additional investment is only, and I say only, is only 30% more than the current business as usual investment plans that are on the books today. So if you think about where we need to get, $27 trillion in additional investment, that sounds like a lot, but it's only a 30% increase over business as usual projections. And in a world where we have had in the last 7 years cost declines of 80% on average in solar, wind, and battery storage, that 30% to my mind seems quite achievable. The question is, how do we get there? So I'd like to congratulate REN21 on this report. I'd like to encourage us all to ask many questions because there's a lot of good data and meat in here. And I'd like to encourage us all to stay focused on how do we address some of the challenges that are highlighted in this report. So with that, I'd like to hand it over now to Christine Linz, who is the co-founder of GWNet, the Global Women's Network for the Energy Transition, which aims at empowering women in the sustainable energy sector. Many of you may know that Christine was Executive Secretary of REN21 from 2011 until 2018. She has more than 20 years of experience in the field of renewable energy resources and recently founded her own company to advance the global energy transition with renewable energy and energy efficiency. She's a member of the board of directors of the International Solar Energy Society, and it's a real pleasure to have her here today to go through some of the overview of some of these findings before we turn it over to the panel. So, Christine, please, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for the nice introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today and to present you the latest findings of REN21's Renewables 2018 Global Status Report. I see that you're trying to dim the light a bit here. That's great, because like this you can see the slides a little bit better. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take you in the next 10 minutes through the main findings of a 300-page report. I'm trying to keep that as entertaining as possible, and then we will have a panel discussion to also put these global findings in a US perspective. And of course, I would be more than happy to answer any questions should there be. Very good, thank you. REN21, for those of you who don't know, is a multi-stakeholder network dedicated to rapidly advancing renewable energy and regrouping organizations in both the private and the public sector from all around the world. The Secretariat is hosted by the United Nations Environment Programme in Paris, France, and it regroups what I always say, a coalition of the willing of national governments, international organizations, industry associations, such as ACORE, one of the co-hosts of this event today, but also NGOs and actors in the field of science and academia. And REN21 has quite, I'm fighting with technology, but there we go, has quite a long-lasting tradition of reporting about the progress of renewable energy policy, investment, market trends, industry trends worldwide. The first Global Status Report was presented in 2015, so you see that we do this already quite a long time. And this work is actually based on the input we receive from over 900 experts from all around the world, both the public and the private sector, and we have an authoring team with people from around the world really picturing the latest trends in policy, investment, and market and industry. This year's report has a particular feature on corporate sourcing of renewables, And actually, 1 year after the announcement of President Trump that the US would exit the Paris deal, I think it's very encouraging to see that dozens of Fortune 500 companies, from tech giants like Apple and Google to Walmart and General Motors, are voluntarily investing billions of US dollars in solar and wind. And I think one of the reasons that they are doing this is definitely the fact that costs for these technologies have come down significantly. And we now have a situation that corporations source renewable electricity in more than 60 countries around the world through corporate PPAs and through utility green procurement programs. And the global cumulative PPA capacity reached 19 gigawatts in 2017, with about 60% of this capacity signed in the US. So on the one hand, we know that political situation might be a bit challenging at the moment. We see that the private sector is really stepping up its commitments, and this is also something that we in general see reflected in the global numbers, where we see that total global renewable capacity increased by about 9% compared to 2016 to 2,195 gigawatt last year, which we see the lion's share coming from solar PV, 55% of newly installed renewables capacity being solar, 29% wind, hydropower 11%, and about 4.6% biopower. The capacity of the US in total renewable installed capacity by the end of 2017 was 241 gigawatts. And I mean, we are, at least in Europe, it's a big deal that the football World Championship is starting. We know that people are quite competitive. So what we are also doing at REN21 is we are listing the champions in the different sectors. And there you see it red circled in the small circles. The US is playing quite a prominent role. Investment in renewables power and fuels, not including hydro, over 50 megawatt. The first country in the world was China in terms of investment, followed by the US, followed by Japan, India, and Germany. But then I would like to attract your attention to the second row on this chart, where you see that when you put this investment in comparison to the GDP of these countries. So when you look at investment in renewables power and fuels per unit of GDP, you see that emerging economies, developing countries are doing quite a lot to really invest in these technologies. Marshall Islands, Rwanda, Solomon Islands, Guinea-Bissau, and Serbia come up on this list. And I think this is something, a global phenomenon that we witness, that renewable energy is not anymore a phenomenon in the industrialized countries as we have seen it in the last decade, but is really spreading to all parts of the world, especially those that still have a lot of need for increasing access to energy, and where we see that there is a lot of investment happening in these technologies. US also quite prominently on the solar PV investment, second position. In wind power, the same, second. Solar water heating capacity, US ranks fifth, and both in biodiesel and bioethanol, the pole position is occupied by the United States. So you already see that the US is quite an important player in this global renewable energy market. Now, when it comes to investment terms, in 2017, roughly 280 billion US dollars were invested in renewables. That's an increase of about 2%. If you include the investments in hydropower, you are at 320 billion US dollars. This investment in renewable power capacity was roughly 3 times that in new fossil fuel capacity. And the United States invested around 40.5 billion, which makes it the largest individual investor among developed countries. When you take up investment of China, Europe, and the US, these three account for nearly 75% of global investment in power and fuels. In the Global Status Report, you then find the different picture for all the different regions, but for the sake of time, I'm not gonna go through this right now. As of 2016, renewables provided an estimated 18.2% of global final energy consumption, with the share of modern renewables rising and the share of traditional biomass luckily going down. So when we now look at the different sectors and the renewables penetration in these, you see that in 2017, renewables accounted for 70% of net additions to global generating capacity. So 70% of all the newly built power plants were renewables-based. Renewables provide 26% of global electricity demand, and in the US, renewables accounted for 18% of total electricity generation. And I think this really, what we can say is that the success story of the energy transition in the last decade has been an electricity transition. So the progress that we see in the electricity sector is really outstanding, and I think this can just tell the story that progress in the power sector shows that the transition to renewables is possible. When we then come to the other sectors, be it heating and cooling or be it transport, we see that the picture is not yet that rosy. The driving force of this development was, as I mentioned initially, was solar and wind. 98 gigawatt of solar PV capacity added in 2017. The global total increased 33%, and that means, ladies and gentlemen, 40,000 PV panels installed in the world every hour. So if we just put that in perspective, we see that this development is really quite an exponential one, as you also nicely see on the graph. More solar PV was installed last year than the net capacity additions of fossil fuels and nuclear combined. And in the US, about 8.2 gigawatt were added, bringing the total installed solar PV capacity of the US to 51 gigawatt. And this is roughly the capacity, the total installed capacity in the US, what China added to its system only last year. So China added 53.1 gigawatt in 2017. That was more than was added worldwide in 2015. And there we see that China reached its 2020 target for solar installations already in 2017. So that just shows I think many industry, I mean, I'm in this sector for more than 20 years, and many players in the industry did not think that this development would be so rapid. So we can actually see that this transition is very quickly progressing. Similar in wind. 52 gigawatt of wind power capacity added in 2017, increasing the global total to by 11% to 539 gigawatt, and also an increase of about 30% in global offshore capacity. In the US, about 7 gigawatt added to 89 gigawatt total. Which also is demonstrated by the fact that high shares of variable renewables on power grids are now happening in many countries around the world. And that shows that renewable energy can and is being successfully integrated into electricity systems across the globe, with high penetration in a country like Denmark reaching 52.9%, Uruguay 28%, Germany 26%, and Ireland 25%, mainly solar PV and wind. And I can assure you that the lights don't go out in these places in the world as some might suspect. When it comes to heating and cooling, the situation is a bit different. Their modern renewable share in heating and cooling is about 10.3%. Mainly biomass is contributing to this. And there we still see that the deployment of renewables in heating and cooling is constrained by low fossil fuel prices and lack of policy support. I'm going to later on show you how many jurisdictions in the world have policy support schemes, and there it's very clear that there is not yet a focus on heating and cooling. North America remained the second largest producer of renewables heat globally. When it comes to transport, the share of renewable power, renewable energy in transport is roughly 3.1%. So we see on the one hand, of course, that as we've seen here also in the champion chart, that biofuels play an important role. But we also see that electric vehicles on the road are advancing. They passed the 3 million mark in 2017. That's an increase of 70%, but it is still only 1% of the light vehicle markets. There's much more potential to get more electric vehicles on the roads and to facilitate high shares of renewables and integration of these variable renewables in the grids. And there are also many initiatives around the world. There's, for example, the Global EV Initiative that aims for electric vehicles to reach a share of 30% of the market by 2030. But we see that in this sector, there is still a very, very long way to go. And actually, when we look at the global picture, we see that the transition is well underway in electricity, but this electricity sector is only representing 20% of final energy use. And the two other sectors, meaning heating and cooling and transport, that are responsible for a lion's share of energy-related CO2 emissions, that those, we've just heard, their progress of renewables is not so rapid. So for these to take off, policy support is really essential. And we see that actually reflected in the chart where you see the landscape of policies. 179 countries around the world today have renewable energy targets. So basically all around the world you have renewable targets. 146 have power targets, and only 42 targets in the field of transport and 48 in heating and cooling. We have 64 jurisdictions in the world with carbon pricing policies, and I think a phenomenon that you also witness here, that the local level and the city level is actively engaging in renewable promotion. In 2017, more than 250 US mayors committed to 100% renewables by 2035 targets. So, but the disconnect between the sectors is also clearly reflected in the policy landscape, where the main focus of policymakers is still on power, and heating and cooling and integrated policies to bring in these sectors are still lagging behind. So, in conclusion, the global renewable power transition is advancing with record capacity additions and rapidly falling costs. That shows that the transition is possible. However, as John has referred to initially, the progress is not fast enough to reach the Paris Agreement goals and also the SDGs. I did not at all present all the figures related to energy access and renewables providing support to these targets. They are also documented in the Global Status Report that, by the way, you can download for free from the REN21 website, including all the infographics. And what is very clear is that a better integration of these sectors in terms of policies, regulatory frameworks is necessary. There needs to be a system approach, also linking energy efficiency and renewables. And there is the need for creating a level playing field for renewables and also decentralized off-grid renewables. Last year was the first year in 4 years where energy-related CO2 emissions went up again. That was mainly because energy demand was increasing. But that is an alarming signal because it shows us that the progress that we are making is there, but it's not fast enough. And there is still much more that needs to be done to better integrate the sectors and put a clear focus on heating and cooling and transport. Thank you very much.
Is this mic working?
Yep.
Excellent. Let me just start by thanking our kind host at the Atlantic Council, and you have wonderful offices here. I was really impressed. Really appreciate your help. Big congratulations to REN21 for their report, really documenting the thriving global business that continues, and really the marketplace that the U.S. is an integral part of. It's really important. Keep that perspective in mind. And big thank you to our panelists today, willing to take time out and join us this morning. So let me introduce the lineup, maybe beginning my left, your right, Tom Kiernan. Tom is CEO of the American Wind Energy Association, and he's been doing that for, 5 years. Hard to believe it's been that long. Before joining...
I don't know if that's a compliment. I'm not sure.
Seems like yesterday, that's what I'm saying. Tom used to be president of the National Parks and Conservation Association, and before that, he was a senior official at EPA. Next to Tom is Genevieve Cullen, who is president of the Electric Drive Transportation Association, which is the industry trade association promoting the electrification of transportation. And Genevieve has come up through the ranks. She used to be vice president there. Thanks for being with us, Genevieve. Kelly Speaks Bachman is CEO of the Energy Storage Association, and she spent 20 years in the sector with a variety of organizations, and used to be commissioner of the Maryland Public Service Commission, my home state. And to my immediate left is Dan Whitten, who's vice president for communications at SEIA, and before that was a reporter with Bloomberg News. Thank you for joining us, Dan. So what we've just heard really is evidence of booming growth in what I guess John characterized as a low-carbon economy, and I think that's a fair characterization. And I think it's worth just taking a moment to get a little better window on the kind of growth we're seeing here in the U.S. And maybe if I could ask each of you to just give a minute or two on what's happening at your sector, maybe starting with Dan and coming this way. Starting with Tom, I point to Tom and say Dan.
All right, consistent with Christine's comments and Greg's comments, the wind industry in the United States is thriving. We deployed, I think it was about 7.9 gigawatts this past year in 2017, anticipating the next several years being similarly strong, if not stronger. That's driven in large measure by the declining cost of wind energy in the United States. We're down by about 2/3 in the cost of wind energy over the last 6 years. In many parts of the country, we are the cheapest source of new electricity, and we're thrilled about that. Part of the reason we have this kind of outlook that's so positive is the orderly phase out of the production tax credit. We're supportive of that. That's giving us a good runway to keep driving our deployment. I imagine we'll talk about it later. Some of the policy proposals from this administration are causing significant concern, unsettledness, uncertainty in the wind industry, especially the president's remarks last Friday proposing a subsidy for coal-fired power plants, for certain coal-fired power plants in the country, and we'll talk about that. That is of significant concern to the wind industry in the United States.
Genevieve, thank you.
Well, first, thanks for having me. I'm really pleased to be here to give you a snapshot of where the electric drive is, and just quickly, electric drive meaning electricity moves the wheel. So that's battery electric, it's plug-in hybrid, and it's increasingly it's also fuel cell vehicles, which are not necessarily grid connected for our purposes. But to give you a sense of how fast this industry is growing, if you look at in late 2010, two models of the Volt and the Leaf were introduced in limited markets in the United States. Now there are more than, just about 50 electric drive models for sale in the United States at various price points, sizes, capabilities. And every major auto manufacturer has announced plans to add to that product line in the next decade. There's also growing movement in the medium and heavy duty sector. As battery prices come down, one telling fact, if you look at the incremental cost of lithium-ion batteries was $1,000 a kilowatt hour in 2008. It's south of $200 a kilowatt hour now, and that's a real game changer. We are looking forward. The projections are pretty bullish on the electrification of transportation, and that actually has great implications for the grid and adding renewables to the grid, decarbonizing the transportation sector, and actually creating just new paradigms, including in automation and shared mobility, and that all have implications for how we use energy and how we move people and things about.
Yes, indeed. Thanks for that. Kelly.
Well, the energy storage industry is doing quite well recently, although it's not a new technology. When you think of all the forms of energy storage, you can look at mechanical storage, you can look at pumped hydro storage, but mostly people today are looking at battery storage, and specifically the lithium-ion batteries, which are enjoying quite some rapid cost declines, which is helping to drive the market. We, as an industry, we installed in the battery side of this 250 megawatts of storage 215 megawatts of storage just last year. For a total of a little north of 800 megawatts, we expect this 1 gigawatt hour cumulative installation to double in next year. We're looking at a $1 billion level of investment by 2019. Storage is generally not necessarily a generation resource like my fellow panelists here, but it's really an enabler of these resources. And so what we're excited about is our potential to help support the grid to make it more sustainable, more efficient, more resilient, and more affordable for consumers.
Thank you. Dan.
Well, first of all, I want to send my regrets from Abby Hopper, who couldn't be here. She's on the other coast in a long-planned meeting to find ways to reduce soft costs for solar, which will make it easier for all of us and much less expensive for all of us to go solar ourselves. So start to look into that, if you would. I wish I could tell you, Greg, what was going on in the solar market, but I haven't checked the news in the last hour, so it's hard to know. But this past year we've had this incredible trade case. The news continues to reverberate every day on that. As Tom mentioned, the coal and nuke bailout has us on the edge of our seats every day. Seems like really bad policy, and we're fighting that. Recently, China just announced new policy cutting back solar there. A lot of questions about what impact that's going to have on our markets. The good news is we have incredible growth. Like Tom, we've grown 59% on average every year for the last 10 years. As we've gotten bigger, the growth rates declined a little bit. It has been surprising in the face of the trade case that we continue to see very active solar development, maybe not as much as there would have been, and we are losing jobs as a result of the trade case, but the market is still very robust, and we're really encouraged by that. The other thing that we're seeing is really strong bipartisan support. Like wind, solar is being built more or as much in red districts as blue. In fact, 13 of the 25 top solar districts in terms of new capacity are Republican-controlled House seats. So we're really excited about the future of solar. We've come a long way. We're going to come even farther, faster. And again, thank you for having us.
Great. Well, so the big picture, obviously, continued growth and investment across all these elements that together really are make up and enable the renewable energy marketplace, which cumulatively scored over $40 billion in new investment last year. So that's 7 years in a row that renewables have been the largest source of private sector infrastructure investment in the country. So that's serious business. But as several of you mentioned, we're up against new forms of uncertainty, and obviously business and investment like certainty, and uncertainty makes life a little bit more difficult, sometimes a lot more difficult. Let's look at the proposal that Tom mentioned, which would, on the basis of resilience of the grid, which is a relatively recent term, it's not entirely clear to me how it's that much different than the term reliability that grids have focused on for decades with some success. But how do renewables fit in this dynamic? When we've looked at it, we see most of the blackouts, most of the cases where we haven't had a reliable electrical structure have been because of problems in the distribution system, and when there have been generator problems, they've typically been associated with flooding or freezing of coal, and not with renewables. But let me ask, maybe starting with Kelly, just because obviously storage has a potential role to play. If you could just give me a minute on storage's potential to help address resilience concerns, and then I'm going to turn to Tom and Dan, just so you guys know what's coming.
Sure.
Okay.
So if you don't mind, I'll just start off a little bit with how we see the difference between reliability and resilience. It gets my former regulator hackles up quite a bit because it's a difficult issue actually for policymakers at the state and the federal level. This differentiation. Reliability really is keeping the lights on during normal operations. Resilience is the ability to withstand external forces or to recover from. So it's the unexpected, and it's a play in the unexpected activities that can happen to disrupt the grid. And what storage does is it essentially, decouples the element of time from generation and distribution. So it absorbs overcapacity and puts it back on the grid when there's undercapacity in terms of generation. And so it can do that during normal operations when you have micro interruptions, or when you have, the sun's not shining, the wind isn't going, or frankly, coal and nuclear can't follow the load because demands are changing quickly, more quickly than they have before with the digitalization and electrification of our society. So for both reliability and resilience, storage is able to inject energy into the grid as needed to keep the lights on.
So in many ways, we're looking for a more flexible grid. That's
Absolutely.
the future, and storage is a big part of that.
Yep.
Can you speak to wind's role, Tom?
Yeah, happy to. And a lot of directions we might go. Let me just start with the administration's proposal is, I believe, putting out there saying we have an emergency, that either on the reliability or resilience front, there's an emergency. The grid operators, the men and women that are managing the grid day in, day out, are on the record saying that the orderly phase out of some of these very expensive coal and nuclear plants does not constitute an emergency. So the grid operators are saying there is not some national security emergency. I also want to point out, people think about, coal and nuke, because they have a steadier, as Kelly mentioned, they can't follow the load, they have a steadier output. Somehow they're providing some additional security or reliability or resilience to the grid. When you look at just the examples in the last several years, in 2014, the polar vortex, 13,000 megawatts of coal went offline. 1,400 megawatts of nuclear went offline during that polar vortex. And during it, wind just powered right on through. The Texas cold snap, 3,000 megawatts of coal went offline because of that on-site fuel, it froze. During Hurricane Harvey, Harvey 2 coal-fired power plants went off because that wonderful on-site fuel was flooded. At Hurricane Harvey, wind, quite interesting, and I think this is speaks to some of the assets, some of the benefit wind brings to the grid. There were some wind farms in the path of the hurricane, and the winds went above roughly the 50-mile-an-hour limit. So we had to feather the blades. They did fine, but we had, if you will, to take those wind farms off the grid. But guess what? There were some wind farms a little bit outside, where it was maybe only 45-mile-an-hour winds. They were ripping. And so the geographic diversity of wind, and frankly, the geographic diversity of other grid energy sources on the grid, provides some strength and resilience to the grid. So actually, during Hurricane Harvey, we powered right through. We had to turn off a couple wind farms, but we did well while a couple of coal-fired power plants went offline because of the flooded fuel supply. So Our point is grid operators aren't saying there's an emergency. The transition that's happening for the grid is a healthy one, and in fact, what solar and wind and storage are bringing to the grid is helping on the reliability and resilience front. A lot more to talk about, but that's at least a quick summary. And Dan, what would you add on the solar side?
Well, it's going to this bailout of nuke and coal. It is concerning. I think every authority that's looked at this has said this doesn't make sense, and yet the train keeps moving in a negative direction, and so that's concerning. Solar, like wind, has so much to offer with regard to assuring that the power is available when it's needed, where it's needed. Solar plus storage is just an incredibly exciting opportunity for all of us, and I know it applies to wind too. You look at California, where they're setting records for the amount of generation from solar, going well into the double digits. That can go even further as storage is incorporated. It can even out things like the duck curve. And then on the other side of it, this distributed generation that you're getting from solar, whether it be community solar or rooftop, I know a lot of people want to say, oh, well, it's disruptive, it adds cost. The fact is that there's a net benefit to having that distributed generation. In no place is that more valuable than the opportunity to take up load when you have an outage, when you need that sort of level of security that the electricity will be there. Particularly with storage, solar and wind and other sources can provide that reliability that you need. So it's incredible. We're excited about the future because we see it as being turning the past on its head and in a very positive way.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. The notion of an emergency, as Tom mentioned, to see an administration preparing to intervene in a marketplace on the rationale of an emergency that virtually every expert, NERC, FERC, the grid operator, PJM, where they all say there isn't one. And it's important to keep in mind that, this is all, it's a business. And business relies on investment, and that's where renewables have been doing great, and that's driving growth broadly in the country. And as mentioned, a lot of this is a very bipartisan thing. There's bipartisan support in the Congress. But what we're looking at when you talk about intervening in the marketplace, it's going to give it the concern that we have, and we have a lot of investor members at ACORE, is how does that play for the investors that are helping make all this happen? We got the number from Christine, almost 280 billion in global investment, over 40 here in the U.S. I guess the question is, what happens to that investment when you don't have confidence that we have a marketplace with integrity? And I'd welcome comments from our panel members on that.
I find this confounding that this administration is taking out of market steps to protect an industry that is itself saying it's not an emergency. I just find that really difficult I was just at the EEI, the Edison Electric Institute annual conference earlier this week, where Christopher Crane, CEO of Exelon, was quoted as saying, "This is not an emergency. This is an issue that may need to be developed, especially with his interests in nuclear, but this is not an emergency." And to take out of market steps just flies in the face of where our industry as a whole, the energy industry, be it renewables, be it energy efficiency, be it the traditional centralized generation assets and the transmission and distribution, we're all saying, hey, this is not a problem. This is an issue that we're working on, but it's not an emergency. And I just find that damaging.
Tom,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I just find it, to Kelly's point, I just find it very telling that Exelon, which is the nation's largest nuclear owner by far, is saying this is a bad idea, and it goes to your investment point. Every single one of these utilities is now going to wind and solar primarily for their new generation. And so, you know, when they're trying to manage their investments in this direction that we're all headed, and somebody puts on the brakes, and then the electric utilities are saying don't do that, it's just really telling.
Yep. If I can jump in with two anecdotes on this same topic. When in 2015 we had the 5-year kind of agreement on the PTC, one of our developers, and I will say most of our developers are international and they're doing wind and solar, but one of those developers said because of that orderly, relatively certain PTC phase out, we are going to move billions of dollars of investment to the United States. So he was shifting significant resources because he goes, wow, that looks like a great, strong, steady market. Let's move to that. This kind of uncertainty is going to shift it the other way.
So we're competing for investment dollars here in the U.S. with other market opportunities around the world. And the message I'm hearing is obviously this undermines our ability to secure those investment dollars.
Yes.
So part of the message here is let us compete, let the marketplace operate. We're not even asking for anything special, and in fact, what we're not seeing is any kind of accommodation that addresses what I would argue is the biggest externality ever, which is the reality that we're talking about generating using electricity without any carbon emissions of any sort.
It's also fascinating to note, I know Sia, I'm not sure, Kelly, whether you are, there's this large coalition that has come together. You guys are part of that to push back on the administration. I mean, it's, yes, renewables, but gas, API, big power users are part of this coalition. So you have the vast majority of the kind of sectors out there using or producing electricity saying this out-of-market solution does not make sense. So
yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, we're competing, at least the wind solar, which has gotten more cost effective as well because of the shale boom. And the natural gas guys are very much allied with us in opposition to the market intervention. So it's an interesting world where renewables and API are together. And somehow the administration has found a way to keep us together. Well, let's talk about another. I do want to pivot to another challenge really coming from market intervention, and that is the tariffs. Originally there were solar tariffs, now there's tariffs on solar, steel, and aluminum, and we're also looking at the potential of retaliatory trade measures that could have impacts as well. Maybe start with you, Dan. Obviously, solar was front and center in this fight. How do you see this impacting growth? There is press about new investments in domestic manufacturing. When you step back, how do you see the impact overall?
Yeah, well, so for our case, we were the initial poster child, sort of maybe even a trial balloon for the Trump administration to see how markets would respond to tariffs. And what we've seen is that we were projecting significant growth, and we haven't seen that growth come to pass this year. There has been continued price drops, and so the solar industry has continued to be able to sort of get projects off the ground, but others are being canceled. I think, you know, in the case of the tariffs, we were very pleased about the ability that we had to build a coalition, again, of strange bedfellows, people that you wouldn't think would support solar, very strong conservative groups came in on our side, and I think that's because they saw this as a test case. And now what we're seeing is an expansion of these tariffs costing the economy potentially hundreds of billions of dollars. And so it's not only bad for renewable energy, it's bad for the economy. And I think we're starting to see that.
So you think solar investment and deployment is decreasing overall as a result of
I think
these
it's not
tariffs?
what it would have been. I don't know that it's going to decrease. Our projections
Decreasing
actually show. Our projections now
business as
actually,
usual.
yeah, our projections actually show a flat year between 2017 and 2018.
Instead of the kind of growth we may be seeing globally.
That's right. Exactly right.
Take your pick. Who wants to jump in next? Tom? I mean, it's still...
Agree. Well, actually, let me back up. The Trump administration has a philosophy or a policy of energy dominance. We support that policy. We believe the U.S. can be, should be, a dominant player in the energy sector, and we see these proposed tariffs as undermining that goal. Obviously, those tariffs will increase the cost of steel towers. It will reduce our ability to compete. I'll also point out that over the last couple of years, wind technicians, the men and women servicing the towers, and solar technicians have been either 1-2 or 2-1 as far as the fastest growing professions in this country. The fastest growing professions. And why are we pushing these tariffs that are going to undermine the two fastest growing professions in this country is obviously not helpful with this goal of energy dominance.
Right?
I'll just say we, as the energy storage industry, are a little less impacted than our friends in the solar industry and the wind industry. We still see our projections going to 35 gigawatts by 2025 of new storage. Right now, we've got about a little north of 800 megawatts. And so while there is impact, especially in our solar plus storage industry or sector of the energy storage industry, we're still pretty nascent and small in terms of the overall capacity on the grid. And so we still see that growth after our analysis continuing.
Greg, if I could, we still see ourselves doubling by 2022. The tariffs are at 30% now. They're going to decline on solar alone. They're going to decline by 5% each year. By 2021, they should expire. So we still, to Kelly's point, we still see powerful long-term growth. In fact, in the next 5 years, we're going to build more solar than we've built in the history of the United States. So the long road is very positive. Mm-hmm. The near term's a little bit frustrating.
I think that is a good summary of the big picture, but year to year, I mean, an issue that I see when I talk to we have members that run across these sectors at ACORE, and one story that I've heard repeatedly in the solar sector is, we're not going to go through with this deal now. We're going to wait for these tariffs to go down because they pencil better. So unlike the situation with the tax credits, where the incentive is historically always been develop now, deploy now, invest now, we have a disincentive to act now. And it's more, if you wait, the numbers work a little better. So are you seeing that, I guess, pushing that growth out for the later years or even after the tariffs?
Yeah, and it's really hard to predict too. It's just things change all the time, as I mentioned earlier. And so, but yes, what we're seeing is a flat growth this year, gradual growth, and then significant growth in the out years.
Genevieve, I want to give you a chance, to the extent that these trade issues are impacting your sector as well.
Well, as we said, the trial balloons of tariffs it starts with solar and then moves across the economy, and now the administration seems to be fixing its sights beyond aluminum and steel and looking at the auto market. And clearly, for what we see, and my members, who include they are electricity producers as well as vehicle manufacturers and the whole global value chain of component pieces of those industries, and putting your finger on different parts of the scale in that industry is obviously disruptive. It's bad for building the global market. It's bad for global investment, and it's certainly something we're not interested in seeing the tariff phenomenon spreading.
Thank you. And it's worth just keeping in mind that the growth of the electric vehicle sector is very much the sort of one obvious approach to address the shortcoming that's highlighted in the REN21 report, and that power generation, we're seeing progress, maybe not fast enough for our climate needs, but a booming business sector there. And we need, if we want to make improvements to the transportation sector as well, we need more of that electrification. And of course, there have been a number of mentions of the ongoing EEI conference in San Diego. I was there as well earlier this week. And what's clear is that electricity demand is largely flat in the United States, partly as a result of all the distributed solar and partly a result of energy conservation. We've kind of decoupled carbon emissions from economic growth here in the U.S., which is good news. And the utilities want to see more and more electrification in order to grow their segment. And that's good news for the utilities and also good news for the renewable sector, because the only rationale to do that is to bring carbon levels down with more renewable generation. So if you're generating power from coal, there's no argument on a policy level that therefore electrification is a good thing. So a bit of a digression, but
if I could, though, just to be clear,
yeah.
And even with coal, you're getting a third less carbon emissions than compared to burning gasoline in a conventional vehicle. So there's still
interesting. Thanks for that. I'm still pushing for renewables, though. I hear you, but I don't care. We can do way better than a third less.
Of course.
Right? We can way better. So, stepping back, it seems to me that, we're into this climate of kind of unnecessary uncertainty. I'd be interested in your thoughts on investment in your sector and kind of what you're doing to try to reassure investors and continue growth, because that's something I think we all need to be focusing on. Mm-hmm. And would welcome brief thoughts, and then we'll turn to questions from the audience. So
I'll jump in with, and it's very much kind of the glass is half full, because it's actually more than half full, but a couple of things about the wind industry that is exciting investors, and that is we now have 4 states that are producing over 30% of all their electric needs by wind energy. Iowa, Kansas, South Dakota, and Oklahoma. Over 30% by wind energy. And we've got some regions of the country down in Texas at ERCOT, over 50%. For a period of time, over 50% of all the electric needs in Texas were provided by wind energy. In SPP, it was over 60%. In Colorado, over 65%. So we're at a point where the grid operators have totally proven that you can have massive amounts of wind and solar, and storage is being so helpful on the grid as well, but massive amounts of wind on the grid and have the grid work well. So we're seeing that vision of significant amounts of wind and solar and storage driving the grid happening not years from now, happening right here and now, where Colorado, 65% of all their electric needs for a period of time were wind energy. So it is exciting. The future is now, whatever you want to say. But it is happening now, and we do see this extraordinary potential in the next several years, and we want it to grow as smoothly and efficiently and quickly as possible.
So you're arguing that reality prevails in the end.
Yeah, and we're proving it out now that you can have a whole lot of renewables on the grid, and the grid operators are able to manage it well. One other just, I think, interesting factoid, there is variability. Wind does not blow all the time. There is some variability, but we're able to predict it so well, point 1 and point 2. Its variability is less than the variability of demand for electricity. So grid operators have, for many, many, many years, figured out how to follow that increase and decrease in our demand for electricity. The variability of wind is less than that, and to some extent, they're doing it in their sleep. It's no big deal. And that's happening here and now.
Well, I just point out from Christine, we saw the numbers from REN21 in countries like Denmark, where the penetration levels are just over 70%? 52% wind? 52% wind in Denmark. Yeah. Others?
Well, for the storage industry, look, costs are coming down astronomically, and they will continue to do so. We've seen 70%, roughly 70% drop in the last eight years. 50% in the last 3 to 4 years. And we're looking at seeing the cost of just the equipment itself dropping 10 to 15% over the next several years to come. And on top of that, that's just on the hardware. Now on the software, on the installation costs as storage is being implemented, those costs are coming down as well. So we really look forward to costs continuing to decline on energy storage. And as much concern as we've spoken about up here with the administration and certain activities that are trying to work, that are sort of working against those tailwinds, there's states and there's federal regulatory action that's being taken at an unprecedented level. And so I'm bullish about not just storage, but the solar industry and the wind industry and the electric vehicle industry about our ability to keep working at a more local level.
Great.
Yeah, our story is very similar to wind and also to storage. Just one sort of anecdote. The solar tariffs were a big kick in the gut, and we have an opportunity for a midterm review. We hope that they'll reverse those tariffs at the midterm review. But to your question about certainty and the need for certainty, I've been pulled aside by several board members recently and said, look, we have certainty now. We know what the rules of the road are going to be. Let's just move forward. Let's stop talking about the tariffs. So that certainty and that generation of investment is real. And it's real important. And so I feel optimistic based on what Tom said and Kelly said. And Genevieve, I mean, your industry is just going off. It's really exciting. But I feel optimistic based on these factors that the certainty is going for us in a positive direction and that the investment's going to grow.
Thank you. Genevieve.
I think to that point, it's exactly, as your members pointed out, that there is this, I'm going to say, hopefully short-term policy uncertainty, where there a lot of pieces have been put in play that we're creating some policy drivers. But the fact is, there's technology momentum and there's market momentum. And my members are talking to Wall Street, and they're saying this is where we're going. This is where our investment dollars are going, because the technology allows us to. This is what the next step of transportation. And the opportunity is absolutely now. If you look at China's commitment to electrification, you have to compete against it. Also, you have to play in that market. So my members have made it clear that in spite of what the roiling waters of Washington policy at the moment, there is, at the international level, at state public utility commission levels, people are investing in electric transportation and infrastructure.
So what you're hearing is a lot of optimism. I think it's economies of scale and technological improvements. You see costs going down across all these sectors and confidence that there is a marketplace, there's a global marketplace, as we've heard, which is immense. And here in the U.S., market forces remain important even now. So with that, let me turn to questions from the audience. This gentleman over here with a beard in the fourth row, sorry. Your hand's up, but I can't.
I'm the guy with the beard. Thank you. I'm Philip
And
Cornell.
if you could please say who you're with.
Sure. Philip Cornell. I'm a senior fellow at here at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center. We talked a little bit at the end about some of the international dynamics. When we're looking at forecasting, a lot of these sectors in terms of capacity additions and technological changes are driven by very large sort of strategic investments from state-owned enterprises. We're used to looking at China. We're used to looking at very big numbers and having an idea of whether those policy numbers and ambitions get carried through. Today, one of those places is very much the Middle East. I'm thinking particularly about solar. Huge numbers in terms of soft commitments, soft pledges, ambitions. And doing forecasts very much depends on what we think are the viability. I mean, when we're talking about some contracts that are 200 gigawatt kind of like solar fields and things like that, how viable do you think those numbers really are? And how do you think that the dynamics in places like the Middle East to bring, let's say, 2 cents per kilowatt hour numbers so low are affecting your industries over the medium term, like looking forward from a tech side and from a global capacity addition side? Thanks.
When you ask how reliable are those numbers, what are you referring to?
Is that realistic? Do you see that?
Oh, it's happening.
Yeah.
Do you want to? I mean, I will say we see bids, Mexico too recently, on that level of price that are, they're happening. Companies are stepping up and building those projects. Yes, Chris.
On the question of the Middle East, I would say that a couple of years ago, there were lots of announcements suddenly that about policy targets, et cetera, and then everybody was looking because, of course, I mean, there's very big solar resources, not much was happening. But I think in the last couple of years, this has really changed. Saudi Arabia massively investing in solar. You take Morocco, basically, take Ouassasat, phase 1, phase 2, having CSP, concentrated solar power, and PV in competition. So these record tariffs or prices that were announced in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi, these plants actually really being built. So I think this is the reality because these countries just simply have realized that harnessing their solar potential, mainly solar, saves them the oil to export it to other places in the world, and this will just save their wealth in the long run. And I think also a big issue for the Middle East is employment. And this is something which Tom has referred to a little bit. We have now 10.3 million people in the world employed in the renewable sector. These parts have very, very young population, and the need to create investment and to create jobs. And with the decentralized nature of renewables, there is a lot of job creation potential. And I think my guess would be that we're going to see a lot happen in this region following these policy announcements on concrete projects.
Let me just suggest on that question too, based on what's going on with the U.S. tariffs and then the recent announcement in China, I would suggest there's a hell of a lot of solar panels out there that can be gotten for very, very inexpensively. So I'd be real bullish. I mean, I'm not an expert on world energy markets, but based on what the analysts are saying, it seems like these things are going to happen.
And in general, renewables have outperformed projections for investment. So a lot of these kind of investment numbers that seem really large, when they put out historically, they have just over and over again been exceeded. So that is the history. Other questions? We hit you right there. Yes.
Good morning and thank you. I'm Augustine Cruz with Silverline Communications. I noticed in the report it was talking a little bit about how renewables are falling a little bit short with respect to heating and cooling, and they noted the importance of AC to well-being and all the rest of it. So I'm curious to know, it's really a general question, your thoughts on how do you see the intersection between your renewables but also building materials and building envelopes, energy efficient fenestration products as part of the conversation of reducing climate change and emissions.
Sure. Thoughts on that? I mean, obviously, California just recently enacted a state law after 2020. All new building, new residential construction has to have a solar on the roof. So clearly, we're seeing an improvement there. Further thoughts on buildings and our sector? I guess there's that side of the meter in the storage world.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, a plug for energy efficiency, since it's not necessarily up here on the stage. I think, when you're looking at going to net zero buildings, you have to start with efficiency first. So it's I used to work with United Technologies with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and we had a mantra of use less, then make more, and then share. So use less energy through energy efficiency in buildings, and then you make more of the zero carbon stuff, and then you share it through bi-directional energy generation and storage. And so I think that combination is a big part of where we need to go if we're focused really on the carbon reduction.
Just to jump in on that California thing, it's really exciting because it does incorporate efficiency. This is a whole house. This is how you build a house for an energy future. And despite what the naysayers were saying, putting solar on a house when it's being built, incorporating efficiency, that's the way to do it. And the payoff periods on that solar, when you put it up as part of that original build, are so short now. And so I think California is obviously very progressive. I think you're going to see what happened in solar. Other states are going to see that it's a darn good idea. So it's a good question, and I think it's a good outlook too.
Right. Right there.
And then I love what you just said, and I think if you extrapolate that concept to the grid, and you look at using the grid more efficiently, the system efficiency of the grid, by having more diverse resources, by being able to smooth out not just the generation side, but the demand side as well through demand response. That's when you're getting the most efficiency, and then you can start to really decarbonize what that lesser amount of generation that needs to happen.
Well, just to say, exactly. And this is what DOE should be focusing on, not taking us back to the 1950s, taking us forward.
Yeah, John Wetmore with pedestrians.org. Puerto Rico, you had the grid go down for an extended period of time. Did you see people coming in and putting in local solar to fill in the gap? And what lessons for resilience and local renewables did they give us?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the situation in Puerto Rico is absolutely dreadful, and there's no way you could build solar or anything fast enough to reverse the calamity that's taking place even still there. I think when you look at Hawaii and their adoption of solar and making that, Hawaii is going to be 100% renewable energy.
But we are seeing investment in solar there as part of the response that's able to happen much more rapidly than the distributed solar in particular.
Right. So I think when you look at Puerto Rico, people are looking at Hawaii as an example, and they are building out microgrids and making sure that critical infrastructure has that power when they need it. I think that there's great opportunity for wind. So I do think that the future, there is things that we can take from Puerto Rico that can help Puerto Rico and other places, but it's really, it still feels bad what's happening there. So
I'll say there's some solar plus storage going in all over the place. I mean, we've been encouraged to see so many folks, not just situated already in Puerto Rico, but even, I'll give a plug to our American electric utilities that have gone down there. I just, earlier this week, I saw a really heartwarming video of people turning the lights back on, right? So that it's 99.34% of Puerto Rico has recovered from that perspective. But they're not recovering just by rebuilding everything. Now we've got developers down there that are looking at solar plus storage opportunities to be able to ride through future storms, because it's going to happen again. And so how do we build a resilience into the grid? I think this is an amazing example that's just started and has still a long way to go, but I see it as an opportunity.
My name is Akshat Rati. I'm a reporter with Quartz. One question that was sort of missing in the discussion around Trump's announcement last Friday is with nuclear. So there was some mention around what Exelon is saying. You've got renewables and API coming together trying to oppose it. What's the dialogue between renewables and nuclear? That's a coalition for a zero carbon electricity grid that sort of works.
It's an obvious coalition, and this is my view. This is not, I'm just representing my own view here. But you would think that would be an obvious future for low carbon electricity generation. The notion of promoting renewable nuclear power on the basis of resilience is sort of playing to its weakness. The one thing that history has demonstrated about nuclear power is that it is not resilient, and you could talk to the people at Fukushima about that, or the first energy plant where they had rusting through to the reactor in Ohio some years ago. Or, long list of examples. Obviously, if you lose cooling water at a nuclear facility, the results are cataclysmic, and to me that's the opposite of resilience. So longer term, the day may come, should come, when there's value to generating power without carbon, and that will benefit nuclear and renewables. welcome other thoughts. Obviously, an important long-term issue.
The only thing I would just add, going back, I think, Kelly, you may have alluded to this. Chris Crane, CEO of Exelon, came out with a statement yesterday where I believe he said something to the effect, please get his exact words, that the approach the Trump administration is putting out there is not the right approach. Correct. Or something along those lines. So, I mean, they clearly have some significant concerns with the administration's approach.
You're right. I think specifically he said this is not an emergency. Not that he doesn't want the issue addressed of fuel certainty. So, but it's not an emergency.
All right. I think we just have time I apologize for one more question, more questions than time. But so raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Yes, right there. Sorry.
I have a question. My name is Michelle Blackston, and I'm from Silverline Communications. I have a question about RPS, because if you remember just a few years back, a lot of these states were actually rolling back their RPS in the states, and then it shifted a lot of jobs. Look at Ohio, for example. They rolled a lot of theirs back, and a lot of companies left. Do you see, because of the lack of action at the federal level, do you see a lot of states putting in these policy maneuvers versus having voluntary goals? We have this renewable energy goal, but having a policy mechanism that encourages job creation in renewable energy and in clean energy technology development.
I'll jump in with a quick comment. We are seeing some wonderful competition among states to attract the jobs and the investment of clean energy. And they're doing it whether through RPSs or other strategies. An example being, I was recently out in New Mexico, which is the fastest growing state for wind energy. And one of the reasons it's the fastest growing, they've got a set of policies that have been supportive. As a result of the availability of clean energy, Facebook announced the significant expansion of their data center there. And I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was going to be several hundred new jobs and X billion dollars of new investment. But the point being, we saw that in New Mexico. There are a number of other states that have had significant, a lot of it's high tech, investment in the state because those companies said, hey, is there clean energy? We'd like to make an investment, but only if there's clean energy. So point being, a number of states are advancing their RPSs, but the RPS isn't the only means a state can be attractive. So the RPS helpful, the targets are helpful. I'll also say we haven't mentioned offshore wind in the United States, which is approaching a renaissance. It is exciting. We're seeing roughly 10 to 12 gigawatts of commitments between now and 2030 of offshore wind, especially off the East Coast, that we think is going to be very cost competitive. The bid dollar amounts aren't yet public, but I understand they're going to be exceedingly inexpensive. So the point being, I think we are seeing a lot of state incentives, RPS or otherwise, that are making a significant difference for, I know, wind energy and I believe renewables and clean economy in general.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that what we're seeing in states in part is a reaction to what we're seeing federally is increasingly aggressive renewable energy directives and climate directives. We just saw New Jersey go to 50%. And it's happening in the most populous states, which have the biggest electricity loads. And so it's a big continuing driver for growth in the sector. And one of the reasons we continue to see a lot of investment and growth is because of the leadership of those states. Let me just thank the panel. Spectacular job here. Thank you, all of you, for being part of this. And turn it back over to David Livingston. Thank you, David.
Great. Thanks all of you for coming. Thanks to our terrific panel. Thanks to ACORE, REN21. Two quick notes I wanted to make sure that everyone heard before leaving. Number one, if you want a hard copy of the Renewables Global Status Report, it'll be available at ACORE's offices this afternoon. You can come by and pick up a hard copy, or of course you can always just go online and get the digital version online. Finally, one thing that was mentioned today is the energy dominance agenda and where renewables and advanced energy fit into the energy dominance agenda. You are all very welcome to join us here next Monday on June 11th for a very special public event with a top advisor to Secretary Zinke, Vince DeVito, who is going to, for the first time, give a public address laying out the role of wind and the role of renewables in general in the administration's energy dominance agenda. So please join us for that, June 11th, here at the Atlantic Council. You can sign up online. Thank you for joining us. Have a terrific day.